Day 266, September 24th, Discipleship, Beyond Bible Studies, 1 Timothy 4 verse 12. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers, in word, in conversation, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. 1 Timothy 4 verse 12. If we were to take a survey of modern discipleship programs, we would find that in many churches, discipleship is comprised almost entirely of Bible studies and social events. Typically, new converts or new members are encouraged to join in small groups which meet weekly at the church or at the homes of those who lead them. At these weekly meetings, there is usually prayer, testimonies, and a Bible study. Sometimes, spiritual goals are set, and an effort may be made to hold one another accountable. Possibly, there are verses to be memorized or opportunities to teach on an assigned subject. Occasionally, the small group will plan events where they have a dinner or fun night out. This is the kind of discipleship program which many Christians have become familiar with. Now, the question is this biblical discipleship? Does this, as a pattern, reflect how Jesus taught his disciples? As we study the Bible, the answer becomes quite clear. Even a quick reading through the Gospels reveals that Jesus had a much more intensive way of discipling. It is true that Jesus took time to teach his disciples by word, but a survey of his ministry clearly reveals that most of his discipling was done by living out the gospel. He called disciples to live and walk alongside him as he ministered. He not only taught them how to live, he showed them how to live. Jesus lived a completely selfless life, living to serve others. Those who became his followers were not only taught his doctrine, but they were confronted with a lifestyle that required them to deny themselves and serve others. One example of Jesus' discipleship method can be found in the 6th chapter of Mark's Gospel. The disciples had just returned from a short-term evangelistic mission, and they began to tell Jesus about all that they had done and taught. Upon hearing the report, Jesus, who knew how tired and hungry they were, instructed the disciples to depart from the crowds and to go into the desert to rest for a while. But when they left the crowds by ship, the people outran them and soon intercepted them. Rather than turning away, Jesus had compassion on the crowds and began to teach them. One can only imagine how tiring this must have been for the disciples, who still had not eaten anything. Finally, when the day was ended, the disciples approached Jesus and asked him to send the crowds away to get food for themselves. But, instead of taking their advice, Jesus said to them, "Give ye them to eat," Mark 6 verse 37. The disciples, puzzled by the suggestion, asked, "Shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread, and give them to eat?" Mark 6 verse 37, Jesus then asked them how many loaves they had, and the disciples answered saying, 5, and 2 fishes. Mark 6 verse 38, then, Jesus commanded the disciples to have all of the people sit down in orderly ranks on the ground. At this point, we can only speculate as to the thoughts of the weary and hungry disciples, especially when we consider that, from their perspective, Jesus was about to give away their meal. As they looked on, Jesus raised his eyes to heaven, blessed the loaves, broke them, and gave them to the disciples to feed the crowds. Then, Jesus divided the 2 fish, and gave the pieces to the disciples. Amazingly, the entire crowd was not only fed, but filled. Moreover, the leftover pieces of bread and fish filled 12 baskets. Only after serving the needs of the crowds before their own needs were the disciples able to eat their fill of the bread and fish. Certainly, this was a lesson in faith, for they had no ability to feed such a crowd from their own resources, but it was also a lesson in selfless sacrifice, for it required them to deny their own hunger and to feed many others before themselves. Through the course of this day, the disciples learned a very memorable lesson about personal sacrifice and putting others ahead of themselves. With this story in mind, we must ask ourselves, is the average Bible study discipleship program teaching us in this way? Certainly, there are exceptions, but the typical discipleship program requires little more than attendance. For all of the knowledge that is taught in discipleship programs, they are often useless in confronting people with the true way of the cross. Furthermore, discipleship without service and sacrifice is dangerous, for it can allow people to suppose that knowledge alone makes them spiritually mature. Consider how, in many churches, there is a lack of willingness to serve. Many Christians come to church on Sundays and Wednesdays, but trying to get them to participate in anything that requires sacrifice is like pulling teeth. We need to understand that many of our discipleship programs are encouraging this kind of behavior. When our discipleship programs amount to Bible studies without personal sacrifice, we are sending a message, the message that being a hearer of the word is enough. If we want to see transformation in the church, if we want to see Christians serving one another in love, then we need to demonstrate and require that kind of living in our discipleship programs. This means discipleship programs that take place out in the community, programs which immediately confront professing Christians with the reality of what it means to be a follower of Christ. We may be surprised at what occurs when we attempt to change the way we do discipleship. We may be shocked to find that many Christians do not want to participate in something that requires them to be sacrificial, selfless, and bold for the gospel. We may be surprised to find that, even among those who would be glad to teach a Bible study, there are few ready to lead others in ministering to the community. We may be surprised that, for many of us, we have been deceiving ourselves, considering ourselves to be followers of Christ without actually walking as he walked. If we compare Bible study discipleship with the method of discipleship Jesus used, we see that one is inward-focused and one is outward-focused. Bible study discipleship tends to focus on whether you have read your weekly lesson, whether you have memorized your verse, and whether you are praying and reading your Bible. In contrast to this, Jesus' discipleship method places you out in the community with him as he serves, and requires you to practice what you believe. By having an outward focus, Jesus did the best thing that he could do for his disciples. He taught them by example. This is exactly what Paul is challenging Timothy to do, to live before other believers as an example. There is no way that Timothy could have fulfilled this by only seeing them once a week in church. There is no way he could have fulfilled this by leading them in a Bible study without leading them in application. For Timothy to be an example to other believers, there had to be opportunities for them to see his life, to see him as he walked in love. There are many Christians who attend church and who desire to participate in ministry and outreach, but who do not know where to go or what to do. In their churches, there are not many opportunities to reach out to the community. As a result, they settle into the pattern which they see around them, a pattern of complacency and spiritual stagnation. This problem, which is common, reflects on the leadership in the church. As our verse shows us, the leadership has the responsibility of showing people, by example, how they are to follow Christ. If we are to change the way we think about discipleship, we need to begin with ourselves. It is easy to criticize others for what they are not doing, but our first task is to reflect on our own obedience. Are we an example to others in word, in conversation, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity? 1 Timothy 4 verse 12? If not, we have no room to criticize others, and, even if we are living as an example, our criticism is better replaced with prayer. Do we desire transformation in our church? Do we desire to see discipleship which reflects the discipleship of Jesus? If so, it must begin with us, laying down our lives in service to others, pouring ourselves out in love to them, spending and being spent for their good. By God's grace, may they see in us a picture of the love of Christ.